So I think once again we've accomplished our mission. We talked about the benefits and costs of renewable resources, how renewable resources can be naturally replenished, and they can be mismanaged by humans, turning them into non-renewable resources. We talked about the benefits and costs of non-renewable resources. We talked about energy sources with environmental consequences. We talked about clean alternative energy sources and environmental friendly renewable resources. We talked about our fossil fuel dependence in the world today. We talked about the consequences, concerns, and strategies that we're going through right now to lessen our dependence on fossil fuels. We talked about alternative renewable energy technology, such as wind, solar, hydropower, biofuel, and geothermal energy. All right, so we talked about hunting at the very beginning of this section, and we talked about how there were different laws that protected the animals that we hunt today. These are regulated by state law. They include the areas that they can be hunted in, the techniques that can be used to harvest them, and the times that they may be hunted. So for instance, certain times of the year you can only hunt using bows. Certain times of the year you can only hunt using guns. And certain times of the year you can't hunt at all. Certain areas you cannot hunt organisms either. So there's a distinction between protected and unprotected species. Now, when we say protected and unprotected, we're not talking about endangered species. But there are some species that are protected that are required. You have to have a hunting license. There are additional regulations, including the United States environmental law and migratory birds and endangered species, which would, of course, be off limits to hunting. So I think once again we've accomplished our mission. We talked about scientific knowledge in society, how we need to use this knowledge responsibly, and how misusing scientific knowledge can be detrimental to us and the environment. We talked about environmental policy and factors and tools that are used to create this policy. We talked about environmental protection. We talked about environmental degradation. We talked about environmental protection issues, such as government involvement and having a contingency plan or a backup plan ready to go. We also talked about the United Nations Environment Program.
Hello, in this question we're going to discuss water resources. The question says to explain why water shortages are expected to be such a widespread problem in the future. Well, what happens is, as we have an increase in the human population, that means we have an increase in the demand for water resources and other natural resources. And with this increase in population, increase in demand, that also leads to an increase in risk of contamination through pollution of these freshwater resources. So as we have an increase in use, that means we have an increase in damage to the environment because of this increased demand and increased risk of contamination. All of these factors together lead to water shortages. So as we know in the future the human population continues to increase, we can kind of foresee that water shortages could end up being a problem down the road. So water shortages are expected to be a widespread problem in the future for these very reasons.
So at the beginning of this section, we talked about water shortages and specifically Africa, how they're experiencing some water shortages. Well, I'd like to talk about one specific lake. The lake is called Lake Chad, and we're going to look at that in just a second. But African lake depletion is a big problem. Population growth, agricultural demands, and pollution are all causing the fresh water in certain parts of Africa to become much more rare. 14 African countries suffer from water shortages of some sort, to some degree. Now, Lake Chad is seeing a lot of depletion. Now, here you can see, as this lake shrinks from 1973, the blue parts of the water, 1987, you can see the blue parts are still the water, 1997, and then 2001. Look how much different this lake was in 1973 and 2001. That lake has changed tremendously, and it's all because we are overusing that water. We're seeing a depletion of natural aquatic life in that area, and since many of the populations in that surrounding area rely on fishing for survival, we're also going to see possibly a large food shortage in the future here as well. So I think once again we've accomplished our mission. We talked about sustainable practices such as water conservation and reduction in pollution, agricultural practices that reduce erosion and pollution, renewable energy resources, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. We also talked about future sustainability. We talked about increased population requires an increase in resources as well. We talked about how current trends show future issues with sustainability. And we talked about how change is required towards more sustainable practices.
Hello, in this question we're going to discuss environmental sustainability. The question says to explain how recycling practices can lead to environmental sustainability. So first of all, what do we mean by environmental sustainability? That means that we are meeting the needs of the current population, and it also means without affecting the needs of the future. So we're not overindulging in the current population so much so that the future population is not going to have their needs met. So that's what we mean by environmental sustainability. We're meeting the current needs of the current population and still ensuring that future needs will be met. So how can recycling practices lead to this? Well, through recycling, we're going to have a decrease in the amount of waste in the environment. So all of the concerns that go along with that are going to be lowered substantially, all of the environmental concerns and the pollution concerns. And also, through recycling, we're going to have a decrease in the amount of raw materials that are going to be used up within the environment because of the fact that we're recycling materials. So recycling practices can lead to environmental sustainability because we're greatly reducing the amount of waste for the current population and for the future, as well as we're recycling materials that we already have instead of using up raw materials that may be depleted for the future. So recycling practices can definitely lead to environmental sustainability.